Hello, I'm Tashawn, and this is Legacy Liner. Welcome aboard. I think we are well overdue for another passenger story. How about you? So in today's video, we're going to tell the story of Father Byles. And as a reward for your patience, I have a special treat. For this video, we have one of the relatives of Father Byles, who I spoke with and interviewed for this video. So we'll be hearing from her in here as well. So, without any further delay, let's get into it. So Father Byles was born on February 26, 1870 in Headingley, England. He was the son of Reverend Dr. Holden Byles, who was a congregational minister and successful businessman. And he was also the pastor of Headingley Hill Congregational Church. So even though Father Byles would later convert to Catholicism, he wasn't born into it, and this would eventually cause a rift between him and his father in the future, but we'll get into that a little bit later. Now, as I mentioned earlier, for this video, we have a special treat. Joan Barry, who is the great niece of Father Byles, she was kind enough to actually do an interview with me and tell me a little bit about her great uncle, Father Thomas Byles. Today we have Joan. Hello, Joan. Welcome. And so I would love to just dig into this story and just hear you talk about Father Byles a bit. So can you please tell us, when did you first hear about your Titanic connection?
I think I've always known about it. I'm sure when I was a little tiny girl, my mother must have told me about her uncle. They called him Uncle Martyr because the Pope had declared him a martyr for the church at the time of the sinking, because they heard of his heroics. So she always referred to him as Uncle Martyr. And so I just grew up knowing I had this great Uncle Martyr. And whenever I'd see a Titanic book or something, I'd look in the index and I'd find his name, and I just always knew.
She has done an amazing job of keeping his story alive. She's given a lot of information to fatherbyles.com, which is where I've got a lot of this information for this video. She has gone out of her way to help keep her loved one's story alive. And on this channel, we are so glad to have her. So please feel free to tell her hi in the comments and let her know that, we're thankful that she took the time to tell us about her relative that was on the Titanic. So an interesting fact is that Thomas Byles was not born Thomas Byles. He changed his name to Thomas whenever he would later convert to Catholicism. He was actually born Russell Byles, and he would change his name later on in life. Now, it would appear that Father Byles may not have had the best physical health whenever he was growing up, because there are letters from him where he mentions that he would have these fits. Personally, from what I gathered, those fits seem more like seizures or something of that nature. In 1912, they didn't really call things the same terminology that we have today in the medical field. But nonetheless, I wanted to mention that it seems like his health issues caused him to maybe not be the most active of children, but he still was very much into his studies, into reading, and especially mathematics. It seems like he had gotten honors growing up in school for his skill in mathematics. Father Byles was educated at Leamington College, and then he also was at the Rossall School, Fleetwood, and Lancashire. Lancashire? I think it's Lancashire. I'm pretty sure like somebody that was British told me like the Shires or Shires or Shears. Lancashire? I'm spending too much time on this, but nonetheless, that's where he went to school. I'm trying. It's a lot with these pronunciations. So it was there at the Russell School where he was a scholar and a school monitor for Crescent House. In 1889, he also went to the Balliol College in Oxford. And it was there that he studied mathematics, modern history, and theology. Now, I just want y'all to picture what the conversation with this man must have been like. This is someone that's clearly well-read, well-educated. He's going on this spiritual journey of trying to find himself. And then he also has this, mathematical brain, but still thinks about theology and just ask all of these in-depth questions about life and loves history. And my God, the conversation with him must have just been outstanding. He would have been one of those people where if you talked to him, he would have had so much perspective. He was also the vice president of the Arnold Society, and then he ended up graduating with a Bachelor of Arts in 1894. So once again, a very well-educated man. I know that he wrote a lot of letters to your grandfather, who was his brother. So can you tell us a little bit about, their relationship?
Okay, so their father was a congregational minister in England, and the two boys, they were the two oldest sons. There were 7 children in the family, but the two oldest, William and Roussel, was his name Roussel before he became a priest. They started branching out and investigating different religions, and they both converted to Catholicism. Mm-hmm. So they were very close because they both became Catholics together, and that caused a lot of turmoil in the family, because their father was a minister, and for his 2 sons to become Catholics, and Catholics weren't really thought that well of in England at the time. So it was really a rough time for them. And so they were very close. Yes.
And so him and William, they kind of talked with each other and on their own and together started researching the Catholic Church. And they both ended up converting to Catholicism. So his younger brother William converted first, and then Father Byles ended up converting not long afterwards. Now his younger brother William, after he ended up converting to Catholicism, he decided to move to America. And he ended up starting a business manufacturing rubber there. Father Byles, or should I say Russell Byles, he ended up converting to Catholicism not long afterwards, and that's when he ended up deciding to change his name to Thomas Byles. And did I see in one of your interviews you mentioned that Father Byles, even though he fell out with his father initially, they did end up making amends before his father passed away? Did I hear that?
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes. On his deathbed, he wrote a letter too, describing the night and how they came to peace with each other. And that was shortly before he set sail on the Titanic. So it was maybe a year before.
Oh my goodness, his father died like a year before the Titanic happened.
Yes.
Oh my goodness. Well, it's tragic, but at least they got to make some peace before they both left this world. So at least they were able to reconcile their differences.
Yes.
Now, a year after Thomas graduated, he ended up taking a job as a master at the St. Edmund's College in Hertfordshire. And this was a boys' Roman Catholic seminary. And in 1897, he ended up having some of his research that he did on the St. Paul to the Corinthians published. So while he was there, he was also, very much heavily researching these different topics that related to Catholicism and that he found interesting. So once again, I really want to emphasize that this was a scholarly type of man. Religious, but scholarly. He ended up working at St. Edmund's until 1899. And that's when he ended up deciding to travel to Rome so that he could study for the priesthood. He received a Bachelor's of Divinity from the Gregorian High School in 1901. And then finally, on June 15th, 1901, he was ordained as a priest. So now we officially have him known as Father Thomas Byles. So then in 1903, he does end up finishing up his studies in Rome. And so he ends up moving back home. He returned to England. After he returned to England from 1905 to 1912, he was a Roman Catholic rector of Ongar in Essex. And so then in 1912, something interesting happens. The younger brother, William, who also converted to Catholicism, he ended up meeting a woman, falling in love with her, and deciding that he wanted to marry. And so who better to officiate over the wedding than your Catholic priest brother? And so when he found out that when he decided to get married, they ended up deciding that they wanted Father Thomas Byles to be the one to officiate over their wedding. And of course, Father Byles, he ended up accepting. And it wasn't just Father Byles who was on his way over for this wedding, because there were 7 of them. There were 7 of these siblings. So it was a big family. So there were multiple siblings who were also coming over for this wedding. So on April the 10th, 1912, Father Byles ended up boarding the Titanic in Southampton, England. Later on that day, when the Titanic was anchored in Cherbourg, Father Byles ended up writing a letter to his housekeeper, Miss Fields. She worked at the same parish as him. And in this letter, he describes pretty much how he's safely on board the Titanic. He talks about the ship a little bit. And then he mentions that the worst thing that has happened so far is that he has lost his umbrella. Which, of course, in hindsight, those words are definitely haunting. And fortunately enough, his great niece, Joan Barry, she actually has a copy of this letter hanging up in her home. And she even was kind enough to read some of the letter off to us. There was a letter where he mentioned that the worst thing that had happened so far was that he had lost his umbrella or something like that.
That's this letter.
Oh, yes. Can you show that to us?
Sure. Can you see it?
Yes, I can. So this is a letter, a copy of the letter written by Father Byles. Yes. And this is what he wrote on April the 10th, you said. And he mentions how he's going to mail this letter out from Queenstown in the morning whenever they leave the next day. Can you give us just like an overview of everything that he kind of goes over in the letter?
Sure. On board ship, one has little to do. His handwriting is kind of difficult to read. I haven't read it in a while. On board ship, one has little to do. So I'll write a letter to you. Everything so far has gone well, except that I have somehow managed to lose my umbrella. I first missed it getting out of the train in Southampton. I think I left it in Liverpool. And then he goes on, he describes the ship. He names all the decks. He says that in Cherbourg, that when he looks down, it's like he's on a tall building.
Mm-hmm.
And he doesn't feel any choppiness at all, whereas the water's a little rough, but everything's smooth sailing. And he can see the tenders in the water bouncing around, but he doesn't feel anything. He says the only thing he feels are some screws.
So the propellers, for those of you that don't know, they were referred to as the screws. So he's talking about he can feel the ship's propellers as they're spinning.
And then he says there were 2 other priests on board. One, a Benedictine from Bavaria, and the other was from Lithuania. So
while on board the Titanic, Father Byles continued to follow through with his priestly duties. He would hear confessions from those that were willing. He also, on Sunday, April 14th, ended up having a mass in the second class lounge. Now, when I read that he had it in the second class lounge, I'm thinking that it was either the second class library or the second class dining saloon, because those tended to be the 2 areas where the second class passengers gathered the most. If you've seen the video that I did on what second class was like for Titanic passengers, I go a little bit more into detail about that. But either or, he ended up having a mass for the second class passengers. But what I found interesting is that he also had a mass for the third class passengers as well. You see, the thing about Father Byles was that he was a man where he took delivering the word of God seriously. How seriously, do you ask? This man had a portable altar that he brought with him on board the ship. And whenever he did his mass in the second class accommodations, he took this little portable altar, and he already had made arrangements with the crew, and he went down into the third class section of the ship and had a sermon or a mass there as well. And not only did he deliver this in English, but he also delivered another sermon in French, because he understood that with these third class passengers, it was a melting pot. You had a bunch of passengers from a bunch of different nationalities. And from my understanding, he also coordinated with another priest who was on board, who did a sermon in German as well. So if you were on the Titanic on the Sunday of April the 14th, there is no excuse as to why come you could not attend one of these religious services that were going on, because there were people delivering these services in all classes and in multiple languages. Back then, it was a much more religious, much more superstitious era. So people took religion way more seriously than what we do today. And the crazy thing is, not only do we know that he gave sermons on this Sunday in both second and third class, but we even know what the topic of the sermons was. The sermon that he gave was, the need for men to have a life belt in the shape of prayer and the sacraments to save their souls when in danger of being lost in a spiritual shipwreck in times of temptation. Just as men require a life belt to save themselves when their lives are in danger of being lost in an actual shipwreck. The irony of it is that he gave this sermon on Sunday morning of April the 14th, 1912. 20 minutes before midnight, at 11:40 p.m. that night, the very ship that he and the people that heard this sermon was on was going to strike an iceberg, and all of them would be associated with one of the most infamous shipwrecks in the history of man. It's just one of those little moments to just think about. Many of the passengers, when the Titanic struck the iceberg, would have been nice and warm in their cabins, tucked into bed, nice and cozy. But not Father Byles. Guess what he was doing? He was up walking the ship praying at 11:40 p.m., at 11:40 at night. Joan Barry, she actually mentions a little bit of this in the interview that I did with her.
They hit the iceberg. He was out on deck.
That was going to be my next question. I heard that he was out on deck at 11:40 at night. Can you explain that for us?
Well, you know my family, that's kind of like, we do that kind of stuff. We go out.
Y'all are night owls?
Yes. Yes.
I can relate to that. I work the night shift, so I get off at midnight, so I'm usually up till 4 or 5 in the morning usually. So he was just walking around on the decks at 11:40, and he was doing, now I'm not very super familiar. Was it a breviary?
Breviary, right. I never say it right either, but breviary.
And so what is that? Is that like a prayer book or a set of prayers?
It's like a prayer book, yes. It has all the gospels and the readings and everything in it.
And that's just one of those little things that I love talking with people related to people on board the Titanic about, is because it just allows you to see that we all have our little hobbies or our little weird things about us, right? I love the way that she mentions in her family being up at 11:40 at night is completely normal. They're night owls. They like being up and about at night. And that's something that I most definitely can relate to. I'm usually up sometimes into the early hours of the morning, There have been times where I've seen the sun rise as I'm getting ready to go to sleep. And that just plays on how we're human, we're people. We all have our individual things. It's just one of those little cool little tidbits that I have to include in here because that's what I like to do. I like to give you this little weird and quirky information about not just what they did on the ship, but who they were as people. And so, being that Father Byles was awake during the impact, he knew pretty early on in the sinking that something was off. He didn't have to be woken up out of his sleep the way that a lot of the other passengers and crew had to. And what does he start doing when he finds out that something is off with the ship? He goes down to the third class accommodations so that he could start escorting the women and children up to the lifeboats. He wanted to render aid to the third class passengers. That is the first place that his mind went when he knew that something was off, which just speaks to his character of who he was as a man. And this is where his previous actions over the last few days really came in handy, because there are a few third class passengers who mention seeing him come down to try to help them up to the boats. And these women, they recognized him because this is the same Catholic priest that did a service earlier this morning. This is the same Catholic priest that has visited them a few times throughout the ship's voyage so that he could hear confessions and offer prayers. So that trust had already been built between Father Byles and a lot of these third class passengers. So just imagine how much comfort he offered whenever he came down to these women who would have been concerned and panicked because they were just awoken out of their sleep. They're told they got to get in these little wooden lifeboats and be put out in the middle of the ocean. And now you have this familiar face, this spiritual man. And remember, once again, this is a very religious era that's coming and offering you comfort, telling you everything is okay. Here's what we're going to do. I'm going to get you to the boats. We'll say some prayers. You know, you want to confess? Okay, that's fine. I'm here. Let's go. He was just offering any type of aid that he could to those in third class. I'm going to let you hear the words from some of the women themselves who remember Father Byles and how he came down to assist them. When the crash came, we were thrown from our berths, slightly dressed. We prepared to find out what had happened. We saw before us coming down the passageway with his hands uplifted, Father Byles. We knew him because he had visited us several times on board and celebrated Mass for us that very morning. "Be calm, my good people," he said. And then he went about the steerage giving absolution and blessings. A few around us became very excited, and then it was that the priest again raised his hand, and instantly they were calm once more. The passengers were immediately impressed by the absolute self-control of the priest. He began the recitation of the rosary. The prayers of all, regardless of creed, were mingled, and all the responses, Holy Mary, were loud and strong. Third class passenger, Miss Helen Mary McClare. Continuing the prayers, Father Byles led us to where the boats were being lowered. Helping the women and children in, he whispered to them words of comfort and encouragement. Third class passenger, Miss Bertha Moran. I first saw Father Byles in steerage. There were many Catholics there, and he eased their minds by praying for them, hearing confessions and giving them his blessing. I later saw him on the upper deck reading from his priest book for hours. Survivors, especially a young English lad, told me later that he pocketed the book, gathered the men about him, and while they knelt, offered up prayer for their salvation. Miss Agnes McCoy, third class passenger. Now, as the story goes, Father Byles was offered a spot in a lifeboat not just once, but twice. And both times he turned the offer down. Even though the rules were women and children first, this was a religious time in history. And nobody wants to be responsible for not letting a priest have an opportunity to get into a boat. And so there was one crew member that was reported to be the one that offered him the chance both times. If there's any proof of who this crew member was, I don't have it. I couldn't find it. I just saw that it was the same crew member twice that had gave him the offer. He chose to stay behind and just spent the time walking around the ship's decks, offering prayer and comfort to those in need of it. Now, I know to some of you, him staying behind, that might not make sense in today's modern world where people are a little bit less religious and a little bit less spiritual. And believe me, I'm no saint by any means. I certainly have my religious beliefs that differs from things that I was taught growing up in a Christian home. What you have to give this man credit for is that he believed in what he was preaching. And so did so many other people who were on board that ship. And even if you're not religious, I want you to just picture something for me. I want you to imagine that you're on the Titanic, all the lifeboats is left, and the ship, she's starting her final plunge. You're horrified. All around you, you can hear the sounds of the ship breaking, the steel bending, the plates buckling. You can hear the sound of dishes shattering, people crying, screaming, praying, arguing, fighting. You're getting bumped into all around you. The cold night air is causing the tip of your nose and for your ears to feel like little needles are pricking them, and then eventually they go numb. And you're just cold and scared and frightened. And you look around you, and the ship's lights, they have dulled down to this hellish, reddish yellow type of color. And you look around and you feel like you are in a scene from Dante's Hell. It's something that you've never seen before. Just this hopelessness, this terror, this fright. And then, through all of this chaos, you hear sound. You hear these words echo across the decks of the ship. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Just hearing these words echo across the decks of the ship, it just does something to you, so you start following them. And you get closer. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. And as you follow that sound and it gets louder and louder, you finally arrive to a part of the ship, and you look and you see Father Byles and then another priest, and they're offering prayers and letting people make their peace with God and save their souls through all of this chaos that's going on around them. And it's a decent sized crowd. It's a crowd of 100 to 200 people. Well, you decide that you're going to join this crowd just because it gives you some sort of comfort. And then it is in this moment that you make one of the final decisions that you will ever make in this life. You decide that if you can't save your mortal body, then at the very least, you can save your immortal soul. So you decide to make your peace with God. And after you do this, you hear Father Byles continue to recite all of these different prayers, continue to comfort the crowd, and then it happens. You can't hold on hardly any longer, and the water is about to take you over. You look over and you hear that priest say the final words that he's ever heard to say. Prepare yourselves, for we are about to see the face of God. That is the comfort that Father Byles offered to a lot of the people who were left on the decks of the Titanic after the last lifeboat had left. I just want you to realize that even if this is the level of comfort that he could offer, that mattered. It meant something to someone. He wouldn't have had that crowd of people around him if it didn't mean something to them. And that's just something I want us to keep in mind when we talk about Father Byles, as well as the other priest that stayed behind and helped. And this is Father Byles' video. That's why I keep saying other priests. But don't get me wrong, I will be getting into his story as well in the future. But since this is Father Byles' story, I want to just kind of stick with him in this moment. Father Byles was only 42 years old at the time. He never married and he never had any kids. Now, the following Sunday, it did end up being a very surreal kind of event, because his younger brother William did end up marrying his sweetheart. And of course, the ceremony was officiated over by someone else. But once the wedding ceremony was over, everyone went home, changed out of the wedding clothes into their clothes for mourning, and then they returned to that same church and had a memorial service for Father Byles. And it was said that there was a great number of people in attendance. Of course, the story of the priest that chose to stay behind and meet his fate with those that were condemned to not having any chance to get in a boat, that is a great story. That is something that's going to resonate with a lot of people. So his story is just one of those that has been woven into the Titanic's legend. We've even seen his story reenacted in a few films about the Titanic, or loosely based on inspiration. And remember, the brother that married his sweetheart in America, they ended up having children. And one of those children was Joan Barry's mother. And she was still alive whenever they went to see Titanic in 1997. And I asked her, I said, well, what was it like seeing, your relative represented on the big screen? And she told me about her mother's reaction. And so when you saw
I took my mother to see it.
Your mother? Oh my goodness. How did she respond seeing it?
Movies weren't really her thing, and so I'm sure the love story, she probably was not crazy about that. But, seeing the priest, and she was like, that's not my uncle, it didn't look like him. But then when the credits started rolling, they mentioned him by name and said Father Byles. And we were both really surprised, because we just thought it would say priest. We didn't know it would actually mention him by name, and that was pretty good. And
that's my video on Father Byles. I would like to thank Joan Barry for taking the time to interview with me for this video. Like I said, let's all give her a shout out in the comments below and thank her for swinging by. I love the opportunity to talk with people who are all about keeping the legacy of their loved ones alive who were associated with this ship. So a very special shout out to her. I would also like to take this time to thank Aidan Mcmichael of the Belfast Titanic Society, because he was the one that was able to get me in contact with her. If you haven't heard of the Belfast Titanic Society, I highly recommend that you go check out their website. I'll have another video posted soon where I was one of the virtual guest speakers for an event, or for one of their talks that they had that was so fun. I'll be sure to post that soon. But I highly recommend that you check their website out, and they have so much useful information and so many people there that are dedicated to keeping the story of this ship alive. And I also want to take this time to thank all of my new subscribers that I have. I think we are over 6,000 subscribers now, which I'm very excited about. So thank you to all the new subscribers. I'm glad that you're enjoying the content. Welcome aboard. And with that being said, that's my video on Father Byles. Thank you. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Y'all be safe, and y'all have a good one.